The bullet that killed Sheriff Ambrose Hawthorne came from a rifle no one in Cedar Bend, Wyoming territory, had ever seen fired, and it left behind a widow who swore on his grave that she would finish what he started. The year was 1878, and the town of Cedar Bend sat in a shallow valley between two ridges of red rock, a place of hard winters and harder men, where the railroad had not yet come, but the promise of it had already brought speculators, gamblers, and worse. Elvira Hawthorne stood at the edge of the cemetery on a Tuesday morning in April, the wind pulling at the black wool of her mourning dress, and watched the last shovelful of earth fall upon the pine box that held her husband. She was 29 years old, though grief had aged her eyes by a decade in a single week, and she had not cried since the morning they carried Ambrose's body down from Widow's Pass, because crying was a luxury she could not afford while the man who killed him still walked free beneath God's own sky. Ambrose had been sheriff of Cedar Bend for 11 years. He had married Elvira when she was 20 and he was 34, a courtship built on quiet suppers and long rides across the prairie, and in the 9 years since, they had built a life together in the small clapboard house behind the jail, a life that included a garden of turnips and beans, a gray mare named Dolly, and an understanding that he would always come home to her, no matter how dangerous the chase. He had broken that understanding only once, and it had cost him everything. For 3 months before his death, Ambrose had been chasing a string of robberies along the stagecoach line that ran from Cedar Bend to Laramie. Strongboxes disappeared from beneath the driver's seats as though lifted by ghosts, and twice a guard had been found unconscious with no memory of how he came to be so. Ambrose had grown obsessed with the pattern of it, staying up past midnight with maps spread across the kitchen table, marking the dates and locations with small red circles, muttering about a fourth man in a gang that the newspapers insisted only had 3. He never told Elvira who he suspected. He only told her, the night before he rode out for the last time, that he was closer than he had ever been, and that if anything should happen to him, she was to look inside the false bottom of his desk drawer at the jailhouse. She had laughed at him then, a nervous laugh born of love and worry, and told him nothing would happen because she would not allow it. He had kissed her forehead and told her that was exactly the kind of thing a Hawthorne woman would say, and then he had ridden out at dawn toward Widow's Pass with 2 deputies at his side, chasing word of a rider seen moving stolen cattle through the rocks. Only 1 deputy came back. Deputy Wilkes returned with a story of an ambush, gunfire from the ridges above, and Ambrose falling from his horse with a bullet through his chest before anyone could see who had fired it. The second deputy, a young man named Tobias Reed, had vanished entirely, and no trace of him was ever found. Not his horse, not his hat, not so much as a spent cartridge bearing his name. Elvira had wept only once in private on the night they brought Ambrose's body home, and then she had wiped her face, put away her handkerchief, and resolved that she would not simply mourn. She would find the truth. The morning after the funeral, she walked into the Cedar Bend jailhouse wearing her dead husband's spare coat over her dress, the sleeves rolled twice at the wrists, and told the new acting sheriff, a portly man named Otis Grimes who had been Ambrose's least favorite deputy, that she wished to see the contents of the desk. "Now, Mrs. Hawthorne," Grimes said, not looking up from the paper he was pretending to read, "I don't think that's proper. This desk belongs to the office now, and the office belongs to the town." "The desk belonged to my husband for 11 years, Elvira said, "and I intend to look inside it, Otis, whether you help me or whether I do it myself with a crowbar from the tool shed." Grimes must have decided a crowbar in the hands of a grieving widow was more trouble than it was worth, because he grumbled and stood aside, and Elvira crossed the small room to the oak desk that had been Ambrose's since before their marriage. She knelt beside it, running her fingers along the underside of the bottom drawer just as he had described, until she found the seam of a hidden panel and pried it loose with a hairpin. Inside was a leather journal, its pages filled with Ambrose's cramped, slanted handwriting, along with a folded map of the territory, and a small tintype photograph of a man Elvira had never seen before, a stranger with a scar above his left eyebrow and eyes that seemed, even in the faded silver of the image, to hold no warmth at all. She took the journal home that night and read it by lamplight until her eyes burned, piecing together what her husband had learned. The robberies were not the work of drifters or desperate cowhands, as the town had assumed, but of an organized ring led by a man Ambrose referred to only as the Colonel, a former Confederate officer turned outlaw who had been moving through the territory for 2 years, always one step ahead of the law, always leaving false trails toward innocent men. Ambrose believed the Colonel had a partner inside Cedar Bend itself, someone who fed him information about shipment schedules and patrol routes. He had not yet discovered who. The last entry, dated the night before he rode to Widow's Pass, read simply, "I believe I know who the inside man is. I will confront him tomorrow after I deal with the matter at the pass. If I do not return, Elvira must not trust anyone in this town blindly, not even those who wear a badge." Elvira closed the journal and pressed it to her chest, and for the first time since the funeral, she allowed herself to weep, not from despair but from a fierce and burning purpose. Ambrose had died with the truth half-formed on his lips, and she would carry it the rest of the way to daylight if it took her the remainder of her life. She did not know, on that lonely night in April, that the man who would help her find that truth was even then riding into the territory from the south, a stranger with sun-darkened skin and a Winchester rifle slung across his saddle, a man named Chester Stone, who had spent the last 6 years hunting the very same colonel for reasons of his own. Chester Stone arrived in Cedar Bend 3 days after the funeral, on a bay gelding worn thin from hard travel, and the first thing he did was ask directions to the sheriff's office. He was 33 years old, broad through the shoulders in the way of men who had spent years working cattle and later years surviving worse, with a weathered face that might have been called handsome if it were not for the guardedness in his gray eyes, the look of a man who had learned the hard way not to trust a peaceful-looking town. He found Otis Grimes behind the desk and introduced himself as a former Texas Ranger, showing a worn badge from his saddlebag as proof, though he explained he no longer rode for the Rangers, having resigned 2 years prior to pursue a personal matter that the organization considered outside its jurisdiction. "And what personal matter is that?" Grimes asked, suspicious in the way of small men given sudden authority. "A man called the Colonel," Chester said, and watched Grimes's face go pale. "I heard tell your sheriff died chasing the same ghost. Thought maybe we could help each other, or maybe I could just look at what he left behind." Grimes told him the desk had already been gone through, that the widow had taken whatever there was to take, and Chester's jaw tightened at that piece of news, because 6 years of chasing a killer across 3 territories had taught him that widows who went looking for answers sometimes found themselves in more danger than they understood. "Where might I find her?" he asked. "Little house behind the jail," Grimes said, "but I'd think twice before knocking on Elvira Hawthorne's door uninvited. She's not been herself since the funeral, and I don't just mean the grieving. She's got a fire in her now that scares half this town." Chester Stone smiled for the first time since crossing into Wyoming territory, a small, tired smile that did not quite reach his eyes but came close. "Sounds like exactly the kind of woman I need to talk to," he said, and walked out into the spring afternoon toward the little clapboard house behind the jail. Elvira answered his knock with a shotgun cradled loosely in her arms, not pointed at him but not put away either, and Chester found himself looking down the barrel of a greener double barrel held by a woman with fierce brown eyes and dark hair pulled back beneath a widow's black bonnet, a woman who looked like she had not slept properly in days and did not care who knew it. "State your business," she said. "My name is Chester Stone," he said, keeping his hands visible and his voice even. "I was a Texas Ranger for 9 years. For the last 2, I've been chasing a man your husband called the Colonel. I believe your husband died because he got closer to that man than any lawman ever has, and I think you might have information that could help me finish the job he started." Elvira studied him for a long moment, the shotgun's weight steady in her hands, and something in his face, some quality of grief matched to purpose, made her lower the barrel by a fraction. "Why should I trust a stranger who rides into town 3 days after my husband's funeral asking about the very thing that got him killed?" "You shouldn't," Chester said honestly. "Not yet, but I'll tell you this much for free, Mrs. Hawthorne. The Colonel's real name is Josiah Vance. He rode with Quantrill's raiders during the war, and after it ended, he decided the killing didn't need to stop just because the flags came down. He murdered my brother in Kansas in 1872, shot him in the back over a payroll robbery, and I have been hunting him every day since. If your husband died chasing this man, then we are already bound together, whether you trust me or not." There was something raw and unguarded in the way he said it, none of the practiced smoothness of a con man or a liar, and Elvira found herself lowering the shotgun the rest of the way, resting the stock against the porch floor. "Come inside, Mr. Stone," she said. "I warn you, if I decide you are lying to me, I will not hesitate to use this gun." "I would expect nothing less from a lawman's widow," he said, and followed her through the door. Inside the small house, Elvira brewed coffee with hands that had grown steadier with purpose in the days since the funeral, and she laid Ambrose's journal on the kitchen table between them, along with the map and the tintype photograph. Chester's breath caught when he saw the image, and his fingers trembled slightly as he picked it up. "That's him," he said quietly. "That's Vance. Younger than when I knew him, but that's him sure as I'm sitting here." He set the photograph down with great care, as though it might shatter, and looked up at Elvira with an intensity that made her chest tighten. "Where did your husband get this?" "I do not know," she admitted. "There is no notation beside it in the journal, only that he suspected the man in this photograph led the robberies along the stagecoach line, and that someone here in Cedar Bend was feeding him information." Chester read through the journal slowly, his lips moving faintly as he traced Ambrose's cramped handwriting, and Elvira watched his face for any sign of deception, finding none, only a growing, grim recognition, as though pieces of a puzzle he had carried for years were finally clicking into place. "Your husband was a careful man," he said finally. "He noted the exact dates of each robbery, cross-referenced against who was in town and who was absent. Look here." He turned the journal toward her, pointing to a page near the back. He'd narrowed the list of possible informants down to 4 men: a rancher named Purcell, the telegraph operator, a saloon owner called Dutch Holly's End. Chester's finger stopped and his face darkened. "And Otis Grimes." Elvira's hand flew to her mouth. "Otis is the acting sheriff now. He has access to everything, every patrol schedule, every shipment date." "Which means," Chester said slowly, "that if he is the informant, he already knows we are looking into this, because I walked straight into his office an hour ago and told him exactly what I was here to do." They looked at each other across the small kitchen table, and in that shared moment of realization, something passed between them beyond mere alliance, a recognition of two people bound by loss and purpose who had, without quite meaning to, become each other's best hope of ever seeing justice done. That night, Elvira could not sleep. She lay awake in the bed she had shared with Ambrose for 9 years, staring at the ceiling, thinking of Chester Stone's gray eyes and the way his voice had roughened when he spoke of his brother. She told herself it was only the shared grief that drew her to trust him, only the desperate need for an ally in a town that suddenly felt full of shadows and secrets. She told herself this, and did not quite believe it, and felt a small stab of guilt for even considering such thoughts so soon after burying her husband. 3 miles outside of town, in the small room he had rented above the Mercantile, Chester Stone lay equally awake, staring at the same photograph of Josiah Vance that he had carried folded in his breast pocket for 6 years. Though this copy, taken from Ambrose Hawthorne's desk, showed a face slightly younger than the one burned into his memory. He thought of the widow with the shotgun and the fierce brown eyes, the way she had not flinched when he told her the truth about her husband's death, the way she had listened to his own grief without pity, only with the same hard-edged understanding of a person who had also lost everything to the same enemy. He told himself it was only the shared purpose that made him think of her, and did not quite believe that either. The following morning, Elvira and Chester met again, this time at the edge of town near the old grain mill, away from the prying eyes and loose tongues of Cedar Bend's main street. They agreed that Otis Grimes could not be confronted directly, not yet, not without proof, because a man desperate enough to betray the law once would not hesitate to run, or worse, to warn Vance that the widow and the ranger were closing in. "We need to find Purcell, the telegraph operator, and Dutch Hollies," Chester said, "and rule each of them out one at a time, quiet-like, before we ever look at Grimes directly. If he suspects we're onto him, he'll bolt, or he'll send word to Vance, and then we lose whatever advantage your husband's death bought us." "And if it is not Grimes," Elvira asked, "if it is one of the others?" "Then we've saved ourselves a hanging judge's worth of trouble by not accusing an innocent man," Chester said. "Either way, we move careful." They began with the telegraph operator, a nervous young man named Aldous Finch who kept meticulous records of every message sent and received through Cedar Bend's small telegraph office. Elvira visited him alone, using the pretext of settling Ambrose's accounts, and found nothing in his demeanor but grief for a sheriff he had genuinely admired and a stack of receipts that showed no unusual correspondence beyond the ordinary business of ranchers and merchants. Purcell, the rancher, proved harder to reach, as he had taken his cattle to summer pasture in the higher country and would not return for weeks, but Chester rode out to speak with his foreman and learned that Purcell had been in Cheyenne on business during at least 2 of the robberies, a fact confirmed by hotel records the foreman happened to mention, which left him unlikely as the informant, though not entirely cleared. That left Dutch Hollies, owner of the Silver Spur Saloon, a broad-shouldered man with a graying mustache and a reputation for running an honest house, despite the rough company his establishment attracted. Chester visited him under the guise of a traveler looking for work, and over the course of an evening of careful conversation and 2 glasses of rye whiskey, he came to believe that Hollies, whatever else he might be, was no traitor. The man spoke of Sheriff Hawthorne with genuine respect, and when Chester mentioned the robberies, Hollies cursed the men responsible with an anger too raw to be performance. That left only Otis Grimes, and the weight of that conclusion settled over Elvira and Chester like a stone as they met again 3 days later at the grain mill, comparing notes beneath the shade of its broken water wheel. "It has to be him," Elvira said, her voice tight with a fury she had been suppressing for days. "He's had access to everything. He was the one who insisted the desk had already been searched. He tried to keep me from Ambrose's journal." "We still need proof," Chester said. "A man's word against a badge won't hold up, not in this territory, not with a federal judge riding circuit only twice a year. We need to catch him doing something, sending a message, meeting someone, anything that ties him directly to Vance." It was Elvira who suggested the plan that would, days later, nearly cost them both their lives. She proposed that they let Grimes believe they had given up the investigation, that the widow had accepted her husband's death as an unsolved tragedy, and the stranger from Texas had ridden on to other territories. If Grimes believed himself safe, he might grow careless, might make contact with Vance to report that the danger had passed, and in doing so, reveal himself. "It's dangerous," Chester said, studying her face in the dappled light beneath the mill's broken timbers. "If he's the informant, and he thinks we've stopped looking, he might decide the safest thing is to make sure the widow's suspicions die along with her. I don't like the idea of you playing bait, Elvira." It was the first time he had used her given name rather than the formal address of Mrs. Hawthorne, and something in the way he said it, low and rough with genuine concern, made her breath catch in a way she was not prepared for. "I buried my husband 9 days ago because he chased this man alone and told no one who he suspected," she said. "I will not make the same mistake. If there is danger, we face it together, or not at all." Chester held her gaze for a long moment, and something passed between them that neither was ready to name. A recognition of courage matched to courage, grief matched to grief, and beneath it, unspoken and unacknowledged, the first tender stirrings of something neither had expected to feel again. "Together, then," he said finally, and extended his hand, and when she took it, the warmth of his grip lingered in her memory long after they had parted ways for the evening. Over the following 2 weeks, Elvira played her part with the careful precision of a woman who had spent 9 years married to a lawman and had absorbed, without quite realizing it, some measure of his instincts for deception and patience. She told Grimes, in a conversation carefully staged to seem incidental, that she had decided to sell the little house behind the jail and move to her sister's homestead in Nebraska, that the grief of Cedar Bend was too much to bear, and that she had given up hope of ever learning who truly killed her husband. Grimes had seemed relieved, almost too relieved, and Elvira reported this to Chester with grim satisfaction when they met that night at the grain mill under cover of darkness. "He's going to make contact," Chester said. "I'd wager my saddle on it. A man like that doesn't relax unless he's got a reason to believe the danger's past, and then he'll want to tell his master the good news." They took turns watching the telegraph office and the roads leading out of Cedar Bend, Chester by day under the pretense of looking for ranch work, Elvira by night from the shadow of her own back garden, where she could see the jailhouse window without being seen herself. It was on the 11th night of watching that she saw Grimes slip out the back door of the jail long after midnight, saddle a horse in the livery stable with quiet, careful movements, and ride north out of town toward the higher country, away from any road that led to a neighboring settlement. She woke Chester by throwing pebbles at his window above the mercantile, a scene that might have been comic in any other circumstance but carried only urgency in that dark hour, and within 20 minutes they were both mounted and following Grimes's trail by the light of a half-moon. They tracked him for nearly 6 miles into the foothills, staying well back to avoid detection, until they saw the glow of a small campfire nestled in a hollow between 2 rock outcroppings. Chester signaled for silence, and they dismounted, tying their horses a quarter-mile back before creeping forward on foot through the sagebrush. What they saw at the campfire confirmed everything Ambrose Hawthorne had died believing. Otis Grimes sat across from a lean, scarred man whose face matched the tintype photograph exactly, older now, harder, but unmistakably Josiah Vance, the colonel, the man who had killed Chester's brother and Elvira's husband both. "Told the widow I've got no leads," Grimes was saying, his voice carrying faintly on the night air. "She's given up. Says she's moving to Nebraska, and that ranger stone he's been asking around, but he don't know nothing, just chasing shadows same as always." Vance's laugh was low and cold, the kind of sound that seemed to have no warmth left in it at all. "Stone's been chasing my shadow for 6 years, Otis. He's persistent, I'll grant him that, but persistent men make mistakes, like Hawthorne did." Vance spat into the fire. "Damn fool got closer than any lawman had a right to. Good thing you warned me which route he'd be riding, or he might have caught us with the strongbox still in hand." Elvira felt Chester's hand close over her arm, steadying her, holding her in place, because she had gone rigid with fury at the confirmation of what she already suspected, that Grimes had sent her husband knowingly into an ambush, that Ambrose's death was not merely the result of a chase gone wrong, but a calculated betrayal by a man who had shared coffee with them, who had attended church 2 pews behind them every Sunday, who had stood at Ambrose's graveside with a hat over his heart and false grief on his face. "Easy," Chester whispered, his breath warm against her ear. "We have what we need. Now we get out of here alive and bring the law down on both of them proper." But fate, as it often does in wild country, had other plans. A loose stone shifted beneath Elvira's boot as they began to retreat, the small sound carrying further than either of them expected in the still night air, and Vance's head snapped up like a wolf catching scent. "Someone's out there," he said, already reaching for the rifle propped against his saddle. "Grimes, check the horses." Chester did not wait to see what would happen next. He grabbed Elvira's hand and pulled her into a run, back through the sagebrush toward where they had tied their horses, and behind them they heard Vance's voice rise in a shout, followed by the sharp crack of a rifle shot that sent a bullet whistling, past close enough for Elvira to feel the wind of its passing. They reached the horses and mounted in a scramble of adrenaline and fear, and Chester fired 2 shots back toward the camp, not aiming to kill in the darkness but to buy them precious seconds, and then they were riding hard through the night, back toward Cedar Bend, hearts pounding, horses' hooves throwing up clods of earth in the pale moonlight. They did not stop until they reached the edge of town, where Chester finally reined in his gelding and turned to look at Elvira, checking her over with an urgency that went beyond mere professional concern. "Are you hit? Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough with residual fear. "I'm unhurt," she said, though her hands were shaking on the reins. "Chester, we heard him confess. We heard Grimes admit he sent Ambrose into that ambush. We have enough now to what?" Chester interrupted, and there was real fear in his voice now, fear for her rather than for himself. "Elvira, they know someone was listening. Vance isn't a man who leaves loose ends. If he suspects it was us, and I think he will, he won't wait around to see if we go to a judge. He'll come for us first, and he won't wait for daylight to do it." Elvira's jaw set with the same stubborn courage that had first drawn Chester's admiration, though now that admiration was tangled with something sharper, more urgent, the beginnings of a fear not for himself, but for a woman he had known only a matter of weeks yet found himself unwilling to imagine losing. "Then we do not wait for him to come to us," she said. "We ride to the territorial marshal in Laramie tonight, and we bring back enough men to end this before Vance has the chance to run or to hurt anyone else." It was a 2-day ride to Laramie under normal circumstances, but they made it in a day and a half, stopping only to rest the horses in short bursts, riding through the heat of the day and the cool of the night with a shared, silent understanding that every hour mattered. Somewhere in those long hours of hard riding, between exhaustion and fear and the strange intimacy of shared danger, Elvira found herself watching Chester's profile against the darkening sky and feeling something stir in her chest that she had not expected to feel again so soon, a warmth entirely separate from grief, though it lived alongside it, uneasy but undeniable. They spoke little during the ride, conserving what strength they had, but in the moments when they did talk, sharing a fire on the second night with their horses tethered nearby, and the vast Wyoming sky wheeling overhead in its endless carpet of stars, Chester told her about his brother, a younger man named Daniel who had joined him on a cattle drive that went wrong when Vance's gang ambushed them for the payroll they carried, killing Daniel in cold blood while Chester lay wounded and helpless nearby. "Forced to watch. I carried him 3 miles to the nearest town," Chester said, his voice low and rough with old grief. "He died before we got there. I was 27 years old and I had never felt so useless in my life. I joined the Rangers a month later, told myself I'd find Vance and see him hang if it took the rest of my days. And now," Elvira asked softly, "is that still all you want, Chester Stone? Justice and nothing more?" He looked at her across the small fire, the flames casting warm light across features that had grown in her eyes more dear with every passing day, and something in his gaze shifted, became more open, more vulnerable than she had yet seen it. "I used to think so," he admitted. 6 years is a long time to want only one thing, but lately I've found myself wanting other things too. Things I thought I'd given up hoping for." Elvira's heart beat faster, though she told herself it was only the fire's warmth, only the strangeness of the night and the danger they had shared, and not the way his gray eyes held hers with such quiet, searching intensity. "Such as?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "A home," Chester said. "A place to belong, someone to come back to at the end of a hard road who might actually be glad to see me." He paused, and the silence stretched between them, charged with unspoken feeling. "I know it is too soon to speak of such things, Elvira. Your husband has not been gone a month. I do not mean any disrespect to his memory or to your grief." "I know you do not," she said, and found herself reaching across the small space between them to touch his hand where it rested on his knee. "Ambrose would understand, I think. He was not a jealous man, and he loved me enough to want my happiness even beyond his own life. I do not know what this feeling is that has grown between us, Chester, in so short a time and under such strange circumstances. But I know it is not disrespect to his memory. I think, perhaps, it is a kind of grace." Chester turned his hand beneath hers, so that their palms met, and for a long moment neither spoke, the fire crackling softly between them, the stars wheeling overhead in silent witness to something new and fragile beginning to take root in the ashes of shared grief. They reached Laramie the following afternoon, and Chester's old credentials as a former Texas Ranger, along with Ambrose's detailed journal and their first-hand testimony of what they had overheard, were enough to convince the territorial marshal, a stern but fair man named Marshal Coburn, that immediate action was warranted. Coburn assembled a posse of 6 deputized men, and within hours they were riding back toward Cedar Bend, moving with the urgency of men who understood that every passing hour gave Josiah Vance more time to disappear into the vast, unmapped wilderness of the territory, or worse, to strike first against those who threatened to expose him. They arrived at the outskirts of Cedar Bend, as the sun was setting on the 3rd day since Elvira and Chester had fled the outlaw camp, and found the town in a state of quiet dread. Otis Grimes had not been seen since 2 days prior, having apparently fled once he realized his conversation had been overheard, and rumors were already spreading through the saloons and general store that something was terribly wrong. Marshal Coburn established a base of operations at the jailhouse, and it was there, examining Ambrose Hawthorne's journal and map more carefully with fresh eyes, that Chester noticed something Elvira had missed in her weeks of grief and investigation. A small notation in the margin of the map in Ambrose's cramped handwriting mentioned a cave system in the rocks above Widow's Pass, the very place where he had died, describing it as a possible hideout based on tracks he had followed weeks before his final ride. "That's where they'll be," Chester said, tracing the location with his finger. "It makes sense. Close enough to the stagecoach line to strike quickly, remote enough that no one would think to look there. Vance has probably been using it as a base of operations for months." Marshal Coburn agreed to lead the posse there at first light, but Elvira, watching the men prepare their weapons and check their ammunition, felt a familiar dread settle in her stomach, the same dread she had felt on the morning Ambrose rode out for the last time. "I am coming with you," she told Chester that night, as they stood together outside the jailhouse under a sky just beginning to show stars. "Elvira, it's too dangerous," Chester said, though his protest lacked conviction even as he spoke it, because he had come to know her well enough in these past weeks to understand that she would not be dissuaded by simple appeals to caution. "My husband died at Widow's Pass," she said. "I have earned the right to be there when justice is finally done. I will not fire a weapon unless I must, Chester, but I will not stay behind in this town wondering whether the man I have come to—" She stopped herself, flustered by how close she had come to a confession she was not yet ready to make aloud, and Chester's eyes softened with understanding. "The man you have come to what, Elvira?" he asked gently. "The man I have come to depend on," she said, choosing the safer word, though both of them understood it was not the whole truth. "I cannot simply wait here while you ride into danger. I have already lost one man to that place. I will not lose another without at least being present to see justice done, one way or another." Chester studied her for a long moment and then, against every instinct of caution that 6 years of hunting outlaws had instilled in him, he nodded. "You'll stay well back from the fighting," he said. "You'll carry a rifle for your own protection and you'll follow Marshal Coburn's instructions without question. Do you understand me, Elvira Hawthorne? I cannot lose you too, not after everything." The admission hung in the air between them, more revealing than either had intended, and Elvira felt her breath catch at the raw vulnerability in his voice, the acknowledgement, however indirect, of feelings that had grown between them like green shoots pushing up through the ashes of a burned field. "You will not lose me," she said softly. "I promise you that, Chester." They rode out before dawn the following morning, 7 men and 1 woman, moving quietly through the gray half-light toward Widow's Pass, where the rocks rose sharp and jagged against the brightening sky, and where somewhere in the hidden caves above, Josiah Vance and his gang waited, unaware that the reckoning they had long escaped was finally riding toward them. The approach to the cave system required leaving the horses nearly a mile back and proceeding on foot through terrain that grew steeper and more treacherous with every step, loose scree shifting beneath their boots, the morning air cold enough to bite through jackets despite the season. Marshal Coburn deployed his men in a wide arc around the cave entrance, which had been spotted the previous evening by a scout sent ahead under cover of darkness, and Chester positioned Elvira behind a large boulder with clear instructions to remain there regardless of what she heard or saw. "If shooting starts," he told her, pressing a rifle into her hands, "you keep low and you keep this ready, but you do not come forward unless I call for you directly. Do you understand?" "I understand," she said, though her heart was pounding with a fear that had nothing to do with her own safety and everything to do with the man crouched beside her, checking the action of his own rifle with steady, practiced hands. "Chester," she said before he could move away to take his position, "whatever happens today, I need you to know that these past weeks, riding beside you, learning to trust you, they have been—" She struggled for words adequate to the feeling. "They have given me a reason to keep living, beyond simple vengeance. I did not expect to feel such a thing again, not so soon, not after Ambrose, but I feel it, and I did not want to go into this day without telling you." Chester's face, tense with the anticipation of coming violence, softened into something achingly tender, and he reached out to touch her cheek with fingers that trembled slightly, whether from fear or feeling she could not tell. "I feel it too," he said. "I have felt it since the moment you opened your door with that shotgun and dared me to prove myself worthy of your trust. When this is finished, Elvira, when Vance is brought to justice and this territory is safer for it, I want to speak with you properly about a future, if you would have me." "I would have you," she said, before he could finish the thought, and the words felt like a promise sealed between them even as danger loomed only yards away. There was no time for more. Marshal Coburn's signal came, a low whistle carried on the morning air, and Chester pressed a brief, fierce kiss to Elvira's forehead before moving to take his position among the posse, and then the quiet morning shattered into chaos. The gang, numbering 5 men including Vance and the missing Otis Grimes, had apparently posted no watch, confident in the remoteness of their hideout, and the posse's approach caught them largely by surprise. Shouts erupted from the cave entrance, followed by the sharp crack of gunfire, and Elvira crouched behind her boulder with the rifle gripped tight in shaking hands, listening to the violence unfold with a terror that made the previous weeks of investigation seem almost peaceful by comparison. She heard Marshal Coburn's voice shouting commands, heard the exchange of gunfire intensify, and then, with a jolt of horror, heard Chester's voice cry out in pain. Every instinct of caution abandoned her in that instant. She rose from behind the boulder, rifle in hand, and ran toward the sound of his voice, heedless of the bullets still flying through the morning air, finding him fallen behind a rock outcropping with blood soaking through his shirt at the shoulder, his face pale but his eyes still alert, still fighting. "Elvira, get back," he gasped, even as she dropped to her knees beside him, pressing her hands against the wound to slow the bleeding. "I told you to stay back." "I will not lose you," she said fiercely, echoing his own words back to him, and she meant it with every fiber of her being, feeling something break open in her chest. A fierce protective love that had been building for weeks and now, in this moment of crisis, revealed itself entirely. The gunfight continued for several more minutes, the posse's superior numbers eventually overwhelming Vance's gang. And when the smoke cleared, 3 of the outlaws lay dead, including, to Elvira's grim satisfaction, Otis Grimes, who had died attempting to flee rather than surrender. Josiah Vance himself had been wounded and captured alive, along with 1 remaining gang member, and Marshal Coburn's men were already binding his wounds sufficiently to ensure he would live long enough to face a judge and eventually a hangman's noose for his crimes. But Elvira's attention remained entirely on Chester, whose wound, though serious, proved not to be immediately fatal, the bullet having passed through the meat of his shoulder without striking bone or major vessel. She helped him to sit up against the rock, tearing strips from her own petticoat to bind the wound more securely, while they waited for the posse to secure the area and prepare for the journey back to town. "You disobeyed my instructions," Chester said, wincing as she tightened the makeshift bandage, though there was no real anger in his voice, only a kind of wondering gratitude. "I told you I would not lose you," Elvira said. "I meant it, Chester Stone. I have already buried 1 man I loved this year. I refuse to bury another, especially not one I have only just begun to love." The words hung in the air between them, spoken in the aftermath of violence and fear, more honest than either had perhaps intended in such a moment, but true nonetheless, and Chester's hand found hers, gripping it with surprising strength despite his injury. "I love you too, Elvira," he said. "I think I have for weeks now, though I told myself it was too soon, too disrespectful to speak of it. But lying here, thinking I might die before ever telling you properly, I find I do not care about proper timing anymore. I love you, and if you will have me when all of this is finished and settled, I want to build a life with you, here in Cedar Bend or wherever you wish to go. I want to be the man who comes home to you every evening, who grows old beside you, who never gives you cause to stand at a graveside wondering what might have been left unsaid." Elvira felt tears finally come, the tears she had held back since the morning of Ambrose's funeral, but these were different tears, born not only of grief but of a fierce and overwhelming joy that she had not expected to feel again in this lifetime. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Chester, I will have you. I love you too, more than I know how to say. Ambrose would want this for me, I believe that with my whole heart. He would want me to be happy, and you have made me happier than I thought possible, even amid all this danger and grief." They kissed then, careful of his wound, a kiss that tasted of relief and fear and joy all mingled together, sealed beneath the vast Wyoming sky at Widow's Pass, the very place where Ambrose Hawthorne had died, and where, in a strange and beautiful symmetry, his widow found new love and the promise of a future she had thought forever closed to her. The journey back to Cedar Bend was slower than the ride out had been, given Chester's injury, but it was a journey filled with a quiet, contented joy that neither of them had expected to feel so soon after such violence. Marshal Coburn and his men escorted Josiah Vance and his surviving accomplice in chains, and word had already spread ahead of them by the time they reached town, so that a crowd gathered along the main street to watch the procession, some cheering, some simply staring in solemn relief that the terror which had gripped Cedar Bend for months was finally at an end. Vance was tried 3 weeks later before a circuit judge who traveled up from Cheyenne specifically for the occasion, given the severity and notoriety of his crimes. The trial lasted only 2 days, the evidence overwhelming, including Ambrose Hawthorne's detailed journal, Chester's first-hand testimony as a former ranger who had pursued Vance for years, and Elvira's account of the confession they had overheard at the outlaw camp. Vance was found guilty of multiple counts of murder and robbery and was sentenced to hang, a sentence carried out 1 month later in the town square of Laramie, an event neither Elvira nor Chester attended, having no wish to witness even a deserved death, content instead to know that justice, however grim, had finally been served for Ambrose, for Chester's brother Daniel, and for every other victim of Vance's long campaign of violence across the territory. Deputy Tobias Reed's remains were discovered several days after the confrontation at Widow's Pass, in a shallow grave not far from the cave system, having apparently been killed by Vance's gang during the original ambush to eliminate any witnesses. His family, notified by telegram, traveled from Missouri to claim his body for burial, and Elvira made certain, using funds from the modest reward offered by the territorial government for information leading to Vance's capture, that a proper headstone was erected for the young deputy who had died alongside her husband, a small act of justice and remembrance that felt important to her, a way of honoring all who had been lost in pursuit of the truth. Chester's shoulder healed slowly over the following weeks, tended carefully by Elvira in the little clapboard house behind the jail, and in the quiet hours of his recovery, they spoke often of the future, of what kind of life they might build together in a territory that was slowly, painfully, becoming less wild with each passing year. Chester had no wish to return to the dangerous, itinerant life of a lawman chasing outlaws across state lines, having finally achieved the justice he had sought for 6 long years, and Elvira had no wish to see him ride away from her ever again into danger. "I have some savings," Chester told her one evening in early June, as they sat together on the small back porch watching the sun set over the ridges to the west. "Not much, but enough to start something. I was thinking perhaps of a small ranch. Nothing grand, just enough land to raise some cattle and horses, build a home that is truly ours." "I have Ambrose's pension from the town council," Elvira said, "and the proceeds from selling this house if I choose to sell it, which I believe I do, Chester. I do not think I could remain here in this house with all its memories, not if we are building something new together. Perhaps it is time for both of us to begin again, somewhere fresh." They found land 8 miles outside Cedar Bend, a parcel of good grazing pasture along a creek that never ran dry even in the driest summers, with enough timber nearby to build a proper house and enough open range for a modest herd of cattle. Chester purchased the land that summer, and with the help of several men from town who had come to respect both the widow and the former ranger for their role in finally ending Vance's reign of terror, he built a sturdy log house with a wide front porch and 2 bedrooms, one of which they both agreed, with quiet hope, might someday hold a child. Elvira and Chester were married in September of 1878, 5 months after Ambrose's death, a timeline that some in Cedar Bend whispered was perhaps too soon for propriety, though most understood, upon reflection, that grief and love were not always so easily separated by strict calendars, and that the circumstances of their meeting, forged in shared loss and shared danger, had created a bond that many courtships spanning years never achieved. The ceremony was small, held at the little church in Cedar Bend with Marshal Coburn standing as witness for Chester and Dutch Hollies, whose innocence had been confirmed weeks earlier, standing as witness for Elvira, a gesture of gratitude for the man's help during the difficult weeks of investigation. Elvira wore a simple dress of pale blue rather than white, having decided that white felt inappropriate for a widow remarrying, though the pastor who performed the ceremony, a kind older man named Reverend Adkins who had known Ambrose well, assured her that God cared far more for the honesty and love in her heart than for the color of fabric on her back. Ambrose would be glad, Reverend Adkins told her privately before the ceremony began, to know you have found happiness again, Elvira. He was not a man who believed love should be a finite thing, doled out once and never again. He loved you enough, I think, to want exactly this for you, whatever grief you might feel in choosing it. Those words settled something in Elvira's heart that had been uneasy since the night at Widow's Pass, a lingering guilt that had followed her joy like a shadow, and she walked down the small aisle of the Cedar Bend church with a lightness she had not felt in months, toward Chester Stone, who stood waiting with tears openly visible in his gray eyes, unashamed of the emotion in front of the small gathered crowd. Their life on the ranch, which they named Widow's Grace in a gesture that acknowledged both the pain of its origins and the joy of what had grown from it, proved a happy one, built on the foundation of shared trial and shared triumph that had first brought them together. Chester proved a capable rancher, applying the same careful, patient observation that had once helped him track outlaws across 3 territories to the work of raising cattle and breaking horses. And Elvira, who had grown up on a small farm in Missouri before her first marriage to Ambrose, found deep satisfaction in the work of building a home from raw land, planting a garden larger and more ambitious than the modest turnip patch she had kept behind the jailhouse, and gradually filling their log house with the small comforts and warmth of a life truly shared. In the spring of 1879, less than a year after Ambrose's death and 7 months after her marriage to Chester, Elvira discovered she was expecting a child, news that filled the small ranch house with a joy so profound that Chester wept openly upon hearing it, holding her close and murmuring promises of a future neither of them had dared hope for during the dark days of investigation and danger that had first brought them together. Their first child, a son, was born in December of 1879, during a harsh Wyoming winter that tested every skill Chester had learned in his years of frontier living, as he rode 11 miles through falling snow to fetch the midwife from Cedar Bend, when Elvira's labor began earlier than expected. The boy was born healthy despite the difficult circumstances, and they named him Ambrose Chester Stone, a name that honored both the man who had first loved Elvira and the man who now shared her life, a gesture that moved Reverend Adkins to tears when he performed the christening the following spring. 2 years later, in 1881, a daughter followed, whom they named Josephine, after Chester's mother, and the small ranch house that had once held only Chester and Elvira now rang with the sounds of children's laughter, a transformation that neither of them had believed possible during those dark weeks of grief and danger that had first brought them together beneath the shadow of Widow's Pass. Cedar Bend itself changed in the years following Vance's capture and execution, growing steadily as the railroad finally extended its line through the territory in 1882, bringing new settlers and new prosperity to a town that had once lived under the shadow of an unsolved terror. The stagecoach robberies ceased entirely with Vance's death, and though smaller crimes still occasionally troubled the growing settlement, the particular darkness that had claimed Ambrose Hawthorne's life never returned in quite the same form. Marshal Coburn, grateful for Chester's assistance in bringing Vance to justice, offered him a permanent position as a deputy marshal for the territory, an offer Chester considered seriously but ultimately declined, having found in ranching and family life a peace he had not known he was capable of feeling after years of dedicated pursuit of vengeance. He explained his decision to Coburn with words that Elvira treasured when he repeated them to her that evening. "I spent 6 years chasing one man across 3 territories," Chester said, "and in the end, it was not the chase that gave me what I truly needed. It was stopping, finally, and building something instead of only pursuing something. I have a wife who loves me and children who need their father home each evening, not riding off into danger. I have found what I was truly looking for all those years, Marshal, though I did not know it at the time. I was not only looking for Vance. I was looking for a reason to stop looking, and I found it in Elvira." The years passed gently after that, marked by the ordinary rhythms of ranch life, the births of 2 more children, a second son named Daniel in honor of Chester's murdered brother, and a third child, another daughter, whom they named Grace, completing the meaning embedded in the ranch's name from its very founding. Elvira kept Ambrose Hawthorne's journal in a cedar box on the mantel of their home, a treasured memento of the man whose careful, persistent investigation had ultimately led, through grief and danger and unexpected love, to the family she now cherished, and she made certain her children knew the story of the lawman who had died seeking justice, and of how that justice had eventually been found, and of the strange, beautiful way that love had grown from such sorrow. On quiet evenings, sitting on the wide front porch of the ranch house with Chester's arm around her shoulders, and the sound of their children's laughter carrying from the yard where they played in the golden light of a Wyoming sunset, Elvira often thought of Ambrose, not with the sharp grief of those early days, but with a gentle, grateful remembrance, a recognition that his death, however tragic, had not been the end of her story, but rather a painful passage toward a happiness she had not known to hope for. "Do you ever wonder," she asked Chester one such evening in the autumn of 1885, as their eldest son Ambrose, now nearly 6 years old, chased his younger siblings across the yard with the boundless energy of childhood, "what might have happened if you had arrived in Cedar Bend even a day later or a day earlier, if our paths had somehow missed each other entirely?" Chester considered the question seriously, as he considered most things, with the same careful thoughtfulness that had once made him such an effective tracker of dangerous men and now made him such a devoted husband and father. "I do not believe our paths could have missed each other," he said finally. "I had been chasing Vance for 6 years across half the West, and you had married a lawman determined enough to finally get close to catching him. I think, somehow, fate or providence or whatever name you wish to give it, had already decided our roads would cross in Cedar Bend, regardless of the particular day or hour. Some things feel too right, too necessary to have been left to mere chance." Elvira leaned into his shoulder, watching their children play in the fading light, feeling the particular contentment of a woman who had faced tragedy, and emerged not merely surviving but truly living, truly loved, in a life she had built with her own hands and her own courage from the ashes of terrible loss. "I love you, Chester Stone," she said softly, the words as true and steady now as they had been on that terrible, wonderful day at Widow's Pass when he had first spoken them to her, bleeding and afraid, and yet somehow certain of his feelings even in that moment of crisis. "I love you too, Elvira," he replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head, "more with each passing year, if such a thing is possible. You gave me a reason to stop chasing ghosts and start building a life instead. I will be grateful for that gift every day for the rest of my years." They sat together as the sun set fully behind the western ridges, the sky blazing with the particular gold and crimson beauty of a Wyoming autumn evening, their children's voices calling to each other across the yard, the ranch house behind them warm with lamplight and the promise of supper soon to come. And in that moment, surrounded by the family they had built and the love that had grown from such unlikely beginnings, both Elvira Hawthorne Stone and Chester Stone understood that whatever trials had brought them to this place, whatever grief and danger and violence had marked the path, they had found at last exactly what they had been seeking all along, though neither had known at the beginning precisely what that was. The story of the lawman's widow who had solved the case her husband died chasing became, in time, something of a local legend in Cedar Bend, told and retold in the years that followed, a tale of courage and persistence and unexpected love that seemed to capture something essential about the spirit of the territory itself, a place where hardship and danger walked always alongside the possibility of redemption, where grief could transform, through courage and time and the grace of new love, into a happiness that no one, least of all Elvira herself in those dark days following Ambrose's death, could have predicted or imagined. Ambrose Hawthorne's grave remained in the Cedar Bend Cemetery, tended faithfully by Elvira and later by her children, who grew up understanding that their family's story had roots in tragedy but had grown, through their mother's courage and their father's steadfast love, into something beautiful and lasting. Each spring, Elvira brought fresh flowers to that grave, a gesture of continued respect and gratitude for the man who had first loved her, who had died seeking justice, and who had, through the strange workings of fate and fortune, led her ultimately to the second great love of her life. Chester never forgot his brother Daniel either, and each year on the anniversary of Daniel's death, he rode alone to a small memorial marker he had erected on a hill overlooking their ranch, a private moment of remembrance that Elvira understood and respected, knowing that some griefs, even when transformed by new happiness, deserved their own quiet space of honor. Widow's Grace Ranch prospered over the following decades, becoming known throughout the territory for the quality of its cattle and horses, and for the warmth and hospitality of the Stone family, who never turned away a traveler in need of shelter or a hot meal, remembering, perhaps, their own difficult beginnings and the kindness of strangers like Marshall Coburn and Dutch Hollies, who had helped them in their time of greatest need. Their children grew into adulthood knowing the full story of how their parents had met and fallen in love, a story that included grief and danger and violence, but also courage and persistence, and the transformative power of love found in the most unexpected of circumstances. Ambrose Chester Stone, the eldest, eventually became a lawyer, drawn perhaps by an inherited sense of justice from both his namesakes, while Josephine married a rancher from a neighboring property and raised her own family within sight of the home where she had grown up. Daniel Stone, following in his father's footsteps, became a respected rancher in his own right, while young Grace, the baby of the family, showed an early talent for writing and eventually became something of a chronicler of the family's history, penning a memoir in her later years that preserved for future generations the remarkable story of how her parents had found each other amid tragedy and danger, and how their love had grown into something that lasted a lifetime. Elvira and Chester Stone remained married for 42 years, until Chester's death in 1920 from natural causes at the age of 75, surrounded by his wife and children and numerous grandchildren, having lived a full and happy life built from the ashes of grief and violence that had first brought him and Elvira together. Elvira survived him by 6 more years, passing peacefully in 1926 at the age of 77, having spent her final years surrounded by the family she and Chester had built together, content in the knowledge that she had lived a life of purpose and love, that she had solved the case her first husband died chasing, and that in doing so, she had found a second chance at happiness that few widows in that hard, unforgiving territory had ever dared to hope for. They were buried together at Widow's Grace Ranch, beneath a simple stone marker that read only their names and the years of their birth and death, along with a single inscription that their children had chosen together, understanding that it captured, better than any lengthy epitaph could, the essence of the remarkable love story their parents had lived. Together, they found justice. Together, they found love. Together forever. And in the town of Cedar Bend, which grew over the following decades into a proper city, complete with paved streets and electric lights, and all the modern conveniences that the passing years brought to what had once been wild frontier territory, the story of Elvira Hawthorne and Chester Stone was still told, passed down through generations. A reminder that even in the darkest and most violent of times, love could find a way to bloom, that justice, however delayed, could still be found by those brave enough and persistent enough to seek it, and that sometimes the greatest tragedies of life carried within them the seeds of its greatest joys, waiting only for the right courage, the right persistence, and the right heart to help them grow.